So today we're going to be talking about dog whistle politics, a term that was coined by a man named Ian Haney Lopez, who wrote a book probably a decade ago now by the same name called Dog Whistle Politics. But this is an idea that's been around for a long time. And so we're just briefly going to go through some of the ideas of it, some of the bases of it, and hopefully we're going to declaw the concept. Often when we talk about dog whistles or racism or sexism or any of the isms, people tend to feel on the line, and a lot of times there's a lot of defense involved with discussing these terms if we feel like they apply to us personally at all. So with dog whistles, much like many of the things we're going to talk about in here, I want to take a different approach to this and talk about how the term is actually much bigger and much more layered and nuanced than we typically give it credit for. So when we think of dog whistles, this is what we usually think in the metaphoric sense. We think of this cartoon, this political cartoon that was recently in a couple of different newspapers across the country with Donald Trump dog whistling, and you see these quote-unquote dogs behind him, Nazis and white supremacists and KKK members and skinheads. And you get this idea of a dog whistle is meant to be a shout out to really awful people, and that these awful people are what the dogs are. And this is the reason that when we talk about it and it starts to put anybody personally on the line, it gets really difficult to talk through these things. So I want to think of dog whistles a little bit different. I want to think of the dogs we're talking about more like these, just a group of people that are just everyday people that hanging out playing cards. Or even better, we can think of dog whistles as sort of devices that cause natural reactions in individuals. They can be different sizes and shapes, and they can have different purposes for specific contexts. But the reaction doesn't have to be one that disgusts us. Sometimes the reaction seems quite natural when you see it. Start thinking of it like this, and we get this image of dog whistles as something that everybody sort of has as a natural component of being a human being. And I can give you an example of this. We're going to talk about many examples, but again, I want to start with those that we all probably understand and that are very neutral or even positive at times. So consider this meme. Keep calm, it's 420 somewhere. Now, we are at a cultural point where the term 420 is known by almost everybody. And at some point, this will go from being a dog whistle, a term that really doesn't mean anything except metaphorically, and that a lot of people in the room may not know what you're talking about when you say it, whereas you'll get some winks and some nods from a group of people that know very well you're talking about marijuana. We're almost to a point culturally where this term is just well known. And at that point, dog whistles go from being dog whistles to just whistles, and everybody will know about them. But right now, we can use this as an example of how dog whistles work in a positive fashion. 420 is definitely a dog whistle, and it's one that has very little negative connotation attached to it at this point in history. So to sort of expand our thinking a little bit, consider some of the dog whistles that are everywhere, both symbolic and verbal, and some mix of the two as communication often works. And the way that they work to sort of hegemonically, under the scenes, if you will, or behind the scenes, construct a reality that gives certain people shout outs. It allows certain people to go into certain locations and feel as if they belong or as if they have a friend. So if you are anybody that practices any religion, particularly in America, you often can come across symbology of your religion. So if you are Catholic, you may drive by Catholic churches quite frequently and see a physical structure that normalizes your belief system, and it allows you to know that there are people who believe the same thing that you believe nearby. And this can be very reinforcing. It can be a way to make people feel as if they belong in the world that they are occupying. Imagine some of the jewelry you wear. Crosses were a big thing when I was a kid, and crosses are sort of a shout out to other people that recognize this is a symbol of your religion to say, yes, we are on the same team. Politically, when Ted Cruz and other politicians say, glory be to God, they know very well that they are speaking directly to conservative evangelicals. And these terms are not meant to be anything but that. They are a shout out to a voting bloc that can often be garnered or instigated to action to go vote by simple terms like this if they believe the sincerity of the person saying them. Consider dog whistles that have to do with class, with your economic position in life. Clothing you wear, in the way that many clothing companies put their labels right on the clothing in America, because one of the things that's normalized in Western cultures is to have an outward projection of wealth. One of the biggest ways to pinpoint someone's status level is their operating system. Do you have an iOS system, an Apple, and are you probably somebody that makes more money and has more wealth, or are you somebody that's using an Android system? And also the terminology we use. Do you use terms like the bad part of town or I went to a good school when what you really mean is income and race and all the things that go along with that? And to really give us a bigger example of this and to make sure we're not just talking about conservative dog whistles, which we're going to spend a large percentage of this lecture doing, let's talk about liberal dog whistles. The phrase "sorry, not sorry," which has become to be a slogan for abortion rights and women's rights. The phrase "hope and change" that was attached to the Obama campaign. These are phrases that sort of evoke this guttural response in us, and because we feel happy when we hear hope and change and sort of indignant and double down when we hear sorry, not sorry, they get us on board with that movement. When we hear the 1%, this idea of fairness sparks in us from some of our readings earlier in the semester. And we think to ourselves, well, that's not right. 99% versus 1%, and they have most of the wealth, and it gets us on board. When we hear movements associated with fascism or Antifa, we tend to be more likely to be sympathetic to these movements, and quite often the name Antifa, anti-fascism, is an instigator for people to join this movement because it sounds on its face like it is doing something very different. In the war against women, which is definitely in many contexts a very real thing, the term itself can be used at times to instigate this idea of awareness and how urgent it is that we take action right now. There is a war going on. And such dog whistles do work the same way in the context of liberalism as they do in conservatism. They spark people to action. They excite us to action. The equality symbol, many of us see this on the back of cars and we have no idea what it is. Other of us driving down the road see it and we sort of give a nod out. In that moment we feel a little bit, if we support the equality movement, that we have a friend nearby. 1312 is another example of a dog whistle that many of us don't know about, that is coded. And unless you know what you're looking at, you would not know that this is a sort of anti-police movement slogan, and it would probably be covered up much quicker if it just said what it meant to say. So there's other reasons that people use the coded language. Just like with politics, 1312 is much likely to slip under the radar and to stick on this wall for a lot longer, spreading its message than an outward notion of hate towards cops. And the same is true of political messages. This is the reason that dog whistles exist. So I asked you to watch a few of these clips. I'm not going to show it again, but that was George Wallace. So if you haven't watched it, please pause the video and go watch the George Wallace clip. And I want to talk just briefly about how in the 60s, many political representatives and political strategists began to recognize that the racist terminology was too much and it was going to have to be stripped out of the language of politics. So I want to just give a couple quick examples, lest we think that the dog whistle is a new thing or that it wasn't strategic and that perhaps it was an accident. It was strategic and deliberate the entire political career that it has had. So H.R. Alderman worked for Richard Nixon in 1969, and after the campaign he released his diaries, which said, among other things, that he and Nixon were going to go after the racists. The subliminal appeal to anti-black voters was always present in Nixon's statements and speeches. And he went on to talk about how in certain conversations they had, one in particular, Nixon had said, quote, "The real problem is the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to recognize this." And thus we have the birth of modern-day dog whistles. Now let's fast forward. This is Ronald Reagan, and Lee Atwater was his strategist. And much like with Nixon, after Ronald Reagan's campaign was successful, Lee Atwater also talked at times about how his strategy went. And in a 1981 interview, he talked about the fact that standards were updating, and by 1968 you couldn't use racial slurs anymore, and that what George Wallace had done was sort of problematic. So you say stuff that are coded, things that are coded, forced busing. And I highlighted this word abstract, because that's what he's really focusing on, is that as long as you are abstract enough, you can get away with almost anything. A side note on Reagan's campaign, it's worth noting that Reagan's slogan was also "Let's make America great again," and that his campaign started in a little town in Mississippi where civil rights workers had been murdered by sheriff's deputies and local white folks that were angry that they were there signing people of color up to vote, and the crime had been covered up, and it wasn't until the federal government came in and forced charges on the folks that were involved that it even came to light that this had happened, because the state, including the authorities, the police, wanted to make sure that it was covered up. They had buried the car, they had disposed of the bodies. And in the end, the charges never played out the way that they should have. People were not held to account. But it's worth noting that Ronald Reagan's first campaign speech was in this small town where this happened, and he spoke of how the federal government needed to stay away from states' rights just a short time after these bodies had found, and while this case had just been concluded. So again, when we talk about dog whistles, it's more than just speech. It's also what you say and where you say it and when you say it and how you say it relative to contextual events. I encourage anybody to look that up and find out more about Reagan's initial speech. I'm going to include a couple more videos. I'll ask you to go watch the Bush video against Dukakis. And then I want you to, for those that don't remember, many of you know about this, Donald Trump's political career perhaps started in the late 1980s when a group of young men, black men in New York City, young boys actually, were accused of a brutal rape that they eventually all went to prison for and served long periods of time in prison for, and then were found not guilty based on DNA evidence. Donald Trump's political career began when he published, allegedly out of his own pocket, paid for, this article related directly to this crime that he insisted had been committed by these boys who were based in part on the atmosphere and articles like this, convicted of a crime that none of them had any part in as young men. This continued throughout, though, so dog whistles is still a very real thing. We all remember birtherism and how the first black president was questioned time and again as having been born in Kenya, as if that was just a randomly selected place and as if there wasn't something going on when we were associating the black president with illegitimate citizenship and with Africa. And again, this is just recently through Twitter. As we all know, Twitter has just let him blow up the blogosphere, but he has said the old trope of go back to your own country. And granted, he worded it in grammatically correct language, but that doesn't undo the racism that's part of this. So keep in mind that this is still a very real thing and it's ongoing. In 2005, the chairman of the GOP talked to a group of students and said that the Republican Party gave up on the black vote and had operated under this idea of the Southern strategy and that this was wrong. He confessed to it. He said they were going to turn around and go the other way. And this sounded great, right? 2005, the head person, the head spokesman for the Republican Party is coming clean. In 2010, 5 years later, the now new head of the Republican Party, the new chairman, Michael Steele, said once again, we did use a Southern strategy for a long time and we really shouldn't have done that and we are going to change our ways. So I want to point out that alongside this consistent dog whistle policy that goes on both sides of the aisle, Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton did it as well. It is a way to garner votes if you do it correctly on both sides of the aisle. There's also hand in hand this consistent denial, which is an American thing. We always want to have, in one hand, the ability to act in racist society or in misogynist society or all of the problematic things that are going on around us, but in the other hand, to be able to deny it and to say, no, we are working on that, we recognize it. And as we can see in the last 10 years, this hasn't changed much. Moving forward, just a few things to think about. This is some of the things being touted by Democratic candidates now, and it's not to say whether these are good ideas or bad, it's to say that they appeal to a guttural sense of necessity. Many students that have student loan debt right now that are not sure how they'll ever pay it, hear candidates lean on messages like this and they think to themselves, this is survival, this is a different lifestyle for me and my family. And the same could be said of some of the things that have been said about Donald Trump being immoral and unethical, and the fact that this is some sort of emergency that is predicated on removing him as soon as possible from power because he may make an immoral decision. These are shout-outs that give people a guttural reaction that makes them want to be on board with the speaker, and that's the heart of what a dog whistle is. So as you move forward this week and you complete the readings and you take the quiz, Keep in mind these ideas. Dog whistles are both sides of the aisle. They are both positive and negative, and the reason that they work so well is that they are an unavoidable part of the human condition. As we read in week 1 and 2, there are certain aspects of being a human that are just sort of ingrained in our DNA. We become indignant when we see certain things. We become involved when we see somebody suffering. It is just part of being who we are. And a dog whistle is simply a shout out to the things that as individuals we hold as sacred.